Welcome back, everyone. What a great day so far. Let's continue with Quilty Analytics. It's an integrated strategic and financial services boutique focused on the satellite and space industry. With decades of experience, in-depth knowledge of the satellite and space ecosystem, and a well-established network, they offer their clients a unique combination of financial, technical, and strategic insight to make informed business, investment, and policy decisions, priding themselves on rigorous analysis, independence of thought, and delivering exceptional results. Please welcome Chris Quilty. Welcome, Chris. How you doing today?
Thanks, Hannah. That makes me sound important. Actually, I was, for background, I was 20 years, I was a Wall Street stock analyst at Raymond James. That's kind of my background and how I came at the industry. We cover the space industry from ground equipment to the satellite manufacturers, launch providers, the operators, whether it's in Earth observation or SATCOM, and all the downstream services. So I have a full show for you here. I'm going to blast through some slides, so no multitasking or you'll miss something important. But I actually wanted to start off by, circling back to that sort of Wall Street experience, which is to say, when I went out on the road to meet with a lot of investors, I had to sort of sheepishly admit that, there's a lot of reasons people don't want to invest in space. And what are those reasons? Well, first of all, it's expensive. Like satellites, launch vehicles, this stuff isn't cheap. And certainly when you talk about earlier stage and startup and venture investors, they'd rather hire two guys in an apartment writing software code. So the industry for a very long time had a hard time attracting capital. A second reason why is it takes a long time to do stuff in space. Typical geo satellite that provides your satellite TV at home takes about 3 years to build, and it might take a half a year or a year to actually get it launched and another 6 months to get it operational. And that's time that money's wasting. The other thing is the government. Government can be good, government can be bad. There's a little bit of both in this industry, but the truth is, up until very recently, the space industry was a government-dominated industry. And even today, certain sectors of the industry, like the Earth observation, satellite imagery, is still about 80% government revenues. We see that changing, but for some investors, that's a no-go. It's got a cyclical history, and we'll kind of cover this in a later slide, some ups and downs. There have been some of the biggest bankruptcies in corporate history. Iridium Communications famously went bankrupt for $5 billion after a $5 billion investment was bought in bankruptcy for $25 million, excuse me. And so there's been a lot of jaded investors due to the cyclical nature. Launch costs, and we'll talk about this in spades. It's not only the fact that it's expensive to get to space, but it's also really hard. I mean, up until recently, there might be 1 or 2 chances a month, maybe globally, to get to orbit. We're now seeing SpaceX launch every couple of days. And finally, for the investors out there, this is you'll see the forecast for $1 trillion economy, space economy. The reality is, who here knows who Amphenol is? I didn't, actually. I was just looking for a company that had about $50 billion of revenue, because that's about the enterprise value of every single pure play space company added up today. So it's always been a little bit of a challenge for investors to kind of get in and get out of these names. Now, the good news is the space industry is undergoing an entire revolution. And a lot of it we'll talk about comes due to the lower launch costs. And so the view that people have on this industry has changed demonstrably in the last 5 years. Now, who's ever heard the joke? How do you make $1 million in space? Start with $1 billion, right? And that's true in part. SpaceX and Elon Musk is clearly the exception to the rule, with SpaceX valued at about $140 billion. Jeff Bezos was at one point said he was spending $1 billion a year investing in Blue Origin. You've got Paul Allen and certainly Bill Gates, Richard Branson, and others that have invested in the industry. And that type of capital coming in has been really important to getting companies off the ground. So here's the big issue for the space industry. You can't have a space industry if you can't get to space. And as I mentioned before, launch was rare and very expensive. So what this chart shows is heavy and medium launch vehicles, so big enough to get a big satellite into orbit. And what you see is over the course of about, more than 50 years, the cost of launch didn't change. It doesn't matter whether you were launching on a Chinese rocket, which you can't do anymore, a Russian rocket, which you can't do anymore, or even a US workhorse or European launch vehicle. Really, really expensive to get to space. And what changed that was SpaceX. And you can see both with the Falcon 9 and the Falcon Heavy, it brought down the costs from the historical $10,000 to $20,000 a kilogram down to $1,000 to $3,000 a kilogram. And if any of you saw the spectacular first attempted launch of the Starship last month, when that thing flies and when it's successful, they've talked about launch costs that would equate to hundreds of dollars or $100 per kilogram. So taking 2 orders of magnitude off the cost of launch. And when something like that happens, has a dramatic impact on the industry. So you want to see where SpaceX has moved the needle. Famously, when they first developed the Falcon 9, and they did use a lot of the core technology from the Falcon 1, it cost them about $300 million to do that. NASA and the Air Force are sort of scratching their head. They went back and they did a study, and they determined that using traditional contracting methods, it would have cost about $4 billion to build that same rocket. They didn't say how long it would take, but they'd probably still be building it. Now, that's relevant because, the Falcon 9 isn't the only game in town. They're building, Starship, but NASA has its own program to build a large rocket. In effect, let's call it a Saturn V replacement. Now, there's a problem, which is Saturn V wasn't affordable back when we were doing it in the 70s, and we had all the national backing for spending that type of money. And the SLS program, which is known pejoratively in the industry as the Senate launch system, because it was written into the FY10 appropriations bill without any request for NASA and without any mission or any payload, basically written in to keep the existing shuttle contractors in business after the shuttle shut down. And it's got all old shuttle parts. That thing is going to cost about $4 billion every time they try to launch it. Now, put that in perspective, NASA's budget is about 24, 25 billion. Let's see where the sequester ends up. But, you're looking at a sixth of NASA's budget to launch this thing. So the best they can do is hope to launch it every couple years to be able to afford it. And, you contrast that again with the alternative, which we've talked about, the Starship. They're going to end up launching that thing with about twice the lift capacity of the NASA rocket. And they want to do it on a daily basis, even multiple times a day. When that happens, that will be transformative for the industry. And if you want to see in numbers what's happened with a lot of the launch activity for the industry, this chart here shows, going back to Sputnik, it was kind of a 2-country race between the US and Russia. Russia has diminished both due to quality control problems, and now they're basically shut out of all global markets. But in the meantime, you've had the Chinese come in, and for several years, they were the leading launch provider in the world until SpaceX really hit it into gear. And where we're at now, we've had 2 consecutive years of record launch activity, and it's probably going to beat that record again this year. And just as another side note, Cape Canaveral, Kennedy Space Center, which is the epicenter in the United States for launch activity, what you'll note is, for most of the past 30 years, they had been launching 10 to 20 times a year. Last year, they launched 61 times, and the goal was to hit 100 this year. With a longer term goal, hopefully to get to somewhere of hundreds of launches happening. So again, put this in context. If you're launching a lot more often, you get a lot more stuff in space. And the short answer is it took us 55 years to get 1,000 satellites up and operating on orbit. Last year, SpaceX alone launched 1,700 satellites. And if you want to get an idea for what's happening in the orbital environment, this shows you some of the major constellations that are going to orbit. The light blue are the ones that have launched. And basically the Gen 1 constellation for SpaceX, which is 4,500 satellites, is about up there. Or if it's not, it'll be done in a couple days. OneWeb, Planet, and Spire, all have hundreds of satellites on orbit. But the numbers here, the Gen 2 is 30,000 satellites for SpaceX, and the rest of the numbers here on this chart are about 15,000 satellites on these constellations. Now, I didn't include everybody. There are a lot of vaporware companies out there, and I just took the announced constellations, only looked at the ones that were going to build 200 or more satellites, and I ended up with another 14,000 satellites proposed. Likewise, there's a dozen companies that have gotten FCC approval to launch satellites operating in the V-band, a really high frequency, really high speed. That's about 38,000 satellites. And then you've got Greg Weiler, the founder of OneWeb, who's got a proposal out there for about 340,000 satellites. End of the day, we'll talk later on about debris removal as a separate business opportunity. So, we've kind of focused a lot on the launch side, but the key point I want you to take away here is disruption is everywhere in the space industry. There is literally not a corner of the industry. If you were I won't say fat, dumb, and happy, but if you were a successful satellite manufacturer building geo satellites and you had been doing this for decades, the business as you knew it, even 5 years ago, is gone. You're now seeing hundreds of small sats being built, and the types of satellites and the type of processors and beamforming and antennas are all entirely different. Even something as mundane as the ground equipment, the modems that you have at your house or the things that run the satellite gateways, they're all getting virtualized. They're all pushing data into the cloud. What you're seeing is Moore's Law, which the space industry had been immune to, is suddenly running rampant through the industry. Now, when you think about change, commercial companies are pretty good at that. Who's not good at change? The government. And surprise, surprise, let's talk about what the government's doing. So NASA, which I just kind of eviscerated for their SLS program, is actually doing a lot of good things. And remember, Congress forced them to do it. So let's talk about some of the programs. So commercial cargo. As the shuttle program shut down, they decided we needed to find commercial providers to do this. They had contracts that were awarded to Sierra Space, SpaceX, and Northrop Grumman. I think the original size of those contracts were about $2.4 billion back in 2008. In 2014, they let out separate contracts for commercial crew. And you've all probably seen the highlight reels of SpaceX taking people up to the space station. Again, those contracts were about, I should know the number. Let's call it about $4.5 billion combined, and they continue to grow. Here's one you've probably never heard of: the Commercial Lunar Payload Service Contract. What's that? So this is about a $1.2 billion contract that NASA has decided we're getting out of the business of building the hardware to do these activities. They want to get different sensors or monitoring systems on the moon. They want to check things, but they don't necessarily want to build the hardware in the old way. So what they did was they put out this contract, and it's a fixed price contract awards. And they have handed out contracts ranging from, let's call it $90 to $150 million that tell commercial companies, we don't care how you get it there. We don't care how you launch it. You just put this instrument on the moon and we'll pay you $90 million. That has created an entire infrastructure of companies that are building lunar landers, transportation systems, ground power, and you name it. So they're building out the ecosystem. Likewise, as we know, we're also getting back to the moon with the Artemis program. And once again, they have gone out and said, we're not going to do this. We're going to put out contracts for commercial providers to pursue this. They've awarded about $8.4 billion, primarily to SpaceX and Blue Origin at this point, to go ahead and develop the landers that will put U.S. boots on the moon once again. Likewise, the space station can't last forever. And guess what? It took them a couple of decades and $100 billion to build that thing. They're not going to do it again. Now, the problem is the Russians are talking about putting up their own space station, and the Chinese do. So NASA wants a presence up there, but what they're going to do is they're going to award contracts to commercial companies to use private space stations. There's 4 companies that have been awarded contracts listed here. I've got another 6 companies that are doing this independently. One of those companies has plans to launch their space station on the Starship. And if they get there, their station will be a third bigger than the International Space Station with artificial gravity. And they'll do it for a fraction of the cost. Who does not like change? Well, we're talking about the government. Let's talk about the DoD. So what this chart here shows are major government satellite programs that have been run for over 50 years. So these are generations of programs. So if you talk about something like, pick the middle, signals intelligence, Northrop Grumman has had that program going back to the 1960s. In space-based infrared, using for missile detection, Lockheed won the last round. And when you talk about building GPS satellites, Boeing and Lockheed have been trading it off. But as I note here, in order to play in this business, your logo better be blue. Now, I want to contrast this, which this is the traditional DoD business of building big iron, think hundreds of millions to billion-dollar satellites that go up for 15 years into GEO. Well, what's interesting is in 2019, from whole cloth, there was a new agency established within the Department of Defense called the SDA, or Space Development Agency, which is a procurement agency. And that agency, against all odds, decided that they were going to build a constellation, kind of like what SpaceX is doing, of smaller satellites in low Earth orbit. And likewise, they were going to adopt the SpaceX methodology of what is known in the industry as spiral development. And the idea with spiral development, you don't spend years and years and years designing stuff until it's perfect, and then you build it. You build it so it's 80% good enough. Not going to be 100%, but that last, the last 5% can make the program 10 times more expensive. And they would do this spiral development every 2 years. And knock on wood, they're keeping to that schedule. A little bit behind on the launch, not much, but every 2 years they are awarding new blocks of satellites. And what's interesting about that program, which I'll show you on the next slide, these are the contractors they've selected. Kind of looks like Walt Disney barfed here, right? Everybody and their brother has gotten a piece of the action. Including, several of the companies I think that presented earlier today. This has opened up a huge commercial opportunity for companies that are building satellites, that are launching them, that are doing payloads, that are doing optical cross links, flat panel antennas, you name it. And this has created a whole ecosystem of activity within the commercial industry. And a lot of that technology feeds back through the loop into other planned constellations. Let's talk about weather, just to keep going. I got NASA's logo on here, but really NOAA is the one that flies our weather satellites. We're basically one weather satellite failure away from not having weather. I hate to tell you that, because the way that NASA NOAA acquire weather satellites is not indifferent from how the DoD and NASA used to buy stuff. And the problem is NOAA's been a little bit slower in adopting commercial technologies. But I'll give you one example here. So this satellite, known as the GPM satellite, cost about $1.5 billion to build in 10 years. It's pretty cool. It does, if you think about your local weather station that has the radar that we all see on our phone to look where the clouds are, well, they're doing this from space. And that's great because those weather stations, those ground weather, they're really expensive. So we kind of all assume that you can get that anywhere. But if you travel internationally and you go to a developing world, you know that does not exist. So this can provide that from space to places that are disadvantaged. Now, again, NASA's not doing it, but there is a private company. I think they've raised about $300 million of capital by the name of tomorrow.io. They're building a constellation of 30 of these satellites. And what does that mean? It might not be as high of quality, but whereas that GPM satellite might pass you, oh, I don't know, once every day or every couple days, with this many satellites, you'll get radar coverage every hour. So the actual value that they're creating here is in the refresh rate that the government has never been able to do. And I'll throw a bone out here to Spire, who is very early to the market in weather with their GPSRO technology. They're building those satellites and getting them on orbit for $300,000-$400,000 a piece. They've got a constellation that they'll have of about 100 satellites. All that data is incremental to the stuff that the government did. The government never got more than a half dozen of these satellites built and tested in the early days. And Spire has commercialized that technology, and they are selling it back into not only NOAA, but to commercial weather companies that can use this to improve their forecasts. Let's talk about imaging. This is something that we're all familiar with, satellite imagery. That image there, which is actually the Hubble Space Telescope, which is actually a government spy satellite just aimed at the Earth. Those things cost $1 billion to $2 billion a piece. And what you'll see is over the course of time, the government has maintained about the same number of satellites on orbit because they're expensive, which is between 30 to 50 satellites. And this is everything on the intelligence side, from the National Reconnaissance Office and the Air Force, signals intelligence, electronics intelligence, you name it. The commercial world, which, for a long time kind of operated along that government path of having a limited number of satellites, has exploded in recent years. And what you see is, there's over 400 commercial imaging satellites up in orbit today. If you didn't know it, you are imaged every single day, multiple times a day. Now, fortunately, most of these systems can't read your face or your license plate, at least as far as you know. But the point being, if you think about a situation like Ukraine, it was the commercial companies, it was the Maxars and Black Skies of the world that were providing the imagery, alerting the public that, hey, Russians are amassing forces. And when you look at what's actually happening on the ground today, there is no such thing as camouflage. It used to be you could go hide out somewhere and you'd even know when the government satellites were flying over. Even the most basic Russian tank driver today knows that from the time he pulls into the tree line, he's got 30 minutes to 2 hours before a precision round comes on him, because these satellites are providing targeting data in real time. I also would note, and it might not be as much of a commercial motivation, but for national security purposes, the Chinese are chasing us close behind. And this is a big driver for why the government finds it important to continue funding a lot of the commercial activity, because it's their best way to compete with the Chinese. So that's a lot of stuff. Let's circle back and talk about what the industry is today and where it's growing. So here are some simple numbers. Again, it might be a $1 trillion space economy, but today, when you break it down into the component pieces, satellite manufacturing, about a $14 billion industry that can move up or down several billion dollars based upon volumes. The launch industry, $5 to $8 billion. The good news here is launch costs are coming down. The bad news is launch costs are coming down. So when you're cutting your launch prices in half, you have to launch twice as much just to stay the same. And that's kind of what we've seen in the launch industry in the last several years. Huge increases in volume, but as pricing has come down, we haven't seen huge growth in the actual revenue. Ground infrastructure is about a $15 billion market. We talked about the Earth observation, rounded up to $3 billion. And the biggest and most attractive part of this industry historically were the satellite communications providers themselves. Now we also have, and we've talked about it, these LEO constellations, which are now showing up. The first two on orbit are SpaceX's Starlink, which has been operational for a year and a half, and OneWeb, which just recently completed their final launches, and they're bringing that system into full operation also. These markets are what we would consider the traditional markets. But back to the point I made earlier about launch costs, once you take down the cost of launch, suddenly a bunch of things that you thought you couldn't do in space suddenly become affordable. So I have a list of about 185 companies that are doing things in what we call cislunar space. So think anywhere from low Earth orbit all the way out to the moon. And these are things like space domain awareness, looking around and seeing what's up there. There's several companies doing in-space manufacturing of fiber optic cables, compound semiconductors, pharmaceuticals. Well, they're not doing them now, but they've put up their original test demo satellites. I mentioned we have 10 companies building space stations. The moon, there's more than cheese there. In fact, there are over 100 missions going to the moon by the end of the decade. We just had a recent attempt by the Japanese company iSpace, which unfortunately didn't work out to be the first commercial lander. But just across state from me here in Florida, we've got the Vulcan rocket from ULA launching soon. And there's a commercial lander from Astrobotic on that is going to put boots on the ground as part of the CLIPS program. And they are providing services both back to NASA and several commercial customers. So this is an entire part of the economy that has never historically existed, but there's a lot to be excited about what is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years in the cislunar domain. So lots of stuff going on in the industry. If you had to ask me, you didn't ask me, but I did it anyways. Here's what I think are probably the 4 most impactful disruptors on the space industry today. I'm not going to talk about the first one because we talked about it a lot. I know I focus too much on SpaceX, but they're the most important. There are 100 launch startups out there that at least have a PowerPoint deck, many more that have been funded, and several that have actually made it to orbit. That's important because the launch industry, believe it or not, is constrained. And one reason it's constrained is that Amazon, which is launching their own competitive LEO broadband constellation to SpaceX, bought up basically every single heavy lift rocket in the world from 2024 to 2027, not named SpaceX. So if you're going to launch something big into orbit in that time frame, you better start talking to SpaceX. Consolidation. We are seeing waves of consolidation in the industry. There are big horizontal mergers like the Viasat, Inmarsat, 2 big satellite operators just closed their merger this week, I forget. There's rumors out there about SES and Intelsat merging, but you're also seeing vertical integration. So companies like Intelsat, which is historically was just wholesaling capacity, acquired GoGo, or at least the commercial aviation business of GoGo, so that they can actually sell directly into the airline customers. Likewise, Viasat did a vertical integration down of RigNet to get them into the oil and gas and the maritime market. And we're seeing various consolidation at high level, low level, and something else is happening in this industry that hasn't happened in a real long time, which is private equity has taken an interest to the industry, both in rolling up companies and buying acquisitions out of prime contractors and folding them in. And so that creates another layer of liquidity in the industry that's great for investors because, quite honestly, the space industry had a history of being a bit of a roach motel where you could invest in things, but it was hard to exit. But we saw, certainly in the last 2 years with the SPAC phenomenon, a number of companies come public. So the 2 I want to focus on, I'm not going to focus a lot because they're deep subjects, are these 2 topics of LEO broadband and direct-to-device. And I've got 1 slide apiece on each, so hang on. So LEO broadband, we've talked about it a bit. Here are some of the major players that are building these constellations. Again, nobody had tried to do constellations, like brand new LEO constellations since the 1990s. And every single one of those failed. Well, they all went bankrupt. Some of them did survive through bankruptcy, like Iridium and Orbcomm and Globalstar. We've already had our first round bankruptcy here with this crew in OneWeb, but they're back recapitalized and about to get merged in with one of the satellite operators, Eutelsat. But if you want 1 or 2 takeaways from this slide, because there's a lot of data, One is the scale of the money that they're spending. Amazon, in public statements has said, our initial $10 billion investment in this effort. SpaceX has never really given a number. We kind of ballpark at 10 billion. Telesat, which is trying to build a constellation, is targeting 5 billion. So these are big capital intensive, long-term programs that are going on. The other thing that's notable is the amount of capacity that these things bring online. So put in context, as recently as 2000, I should know the date, 2012, Viasat launched their Viasat-2 satellite, which was the largest, most powerful satellite that had ever been launched. Maybe it was 2015. Never mind. That satellite was 300 gigabits per second. And what you're seeing is, and actually they did just launch their Viasat-3, which is 1,000 gigabits per second, or 1 terabit per second. These constellations, and certainly SpaceX and soon Amazon, are measured in the tens of terabits per second. Now, not all of it's useful out over the oceans or the poles, but the point is there is just gobs and gobs of capacity coming to market. And that's good for us as consumers or enterprises, because for the first time in history, space is doing something that is never done, which is compete with terrestrial. And by that, I mean, if you wanted to use satellite communications, it was always the option of last resort. If you couldn't get anything else, if you couldn't get fiber, you couldn't get DSL, if you couldn't get a coconut phone line, crap, I guess we'll do satellite, because it was expensive and it was quirky. And now what you're seeing is examples where certainly in the consumer market, SpaceX is tremendously competitive in rolling out, 1.5 million subs in literally a year and a half. It took Viasat and Hughes over 2 decades to get to 2 million subs. So lots of change happening here. And the downstream side of this, as these companies build out these constellations, it drives demand throughout the industry for, minor components of, reaction wheels and propulsion tanks and propulsion systems to the launch services, and you name it. So it's building up the broader industry ecosystem. So the other cool technology that I wanted one slide on is direct-to-device. This was the biggest story of 2022 in the space industry, hands down. Now, if you're not familiar with this technology, the idea is you, with your iPhone, your Android device, not a satellite phone, no modifications, you'll be able to talk to satellites in space so that, if you go out of coverage, if you go hiking, if you go backpacking, your phone will work with one of these existing satellite systems. Now, I'm not going to go into the details here, but the point is this was a dumb idea right up until the moment everybody decided they had to do it. And by everybody, you can look at the, the logo cloud here. You've had carriers like Verizon and Vodafone and AT&T and T-Mobile. You've had infrastructure providers like American Tower. And you've got legacy satellite operators and new satellite operators like AST Space Mobile that have announced they're launching these services. This is an industry that, again, if it happens in the way that the operators believe, will become a multi-billion-dollar industry in literally a couple years. Plus, it makes backpacking easier. All right, so let's do some quick deep dives because I got to move fast. Let's talk about the industry over the last 3 years, like what happened, COVID, and we're on. So COVID did have a pretty big impact on the industry, and specifically, for things that are slow, they got a lot slower. Just because of the COVID restrictions, but we're mostly back. Still got some supply chain issues like a lot of other industries, but that one's pretty much over. And, not to go through each of these points here, we've talked about the Space Force and their proliferated LEO, or this system of 1,000 satellites that the DoD is building. As I mentioned, there were a lot of folks within the DoD that poo-pooed the idea, but lo and behold, this constellation is getting funded. They're staying on track. And in fact, what you're now seeing is other defense agencies suddenly saying, hey, you know what? Let's step back and take a look at the way the SDA is doing this and rethink it again. And that's pretty positive. Satcom. I started off by saying this is the largest revenue generating, most investable part of the industry. Well, the reality is it's been an ugly several years for the satellite industry. This traditional Satcom, they've seen revenues decline 5 to 7% a year. And the good news is, just like the launch industry, is because there's introduction of new technology. Things like digital payloads and high throughput satellites, onboard processing, beamforming, all these technologies have made satellite communications significantly cheaper, and the price erosion has caused revenues to decline even as capacity is going up. We're probably hitting a little bit of a inflection point here, and certainly if you roll in the LEO broadband, this is you're seeing the revenues for the industry as a whole starting to go up. But there are challenges between the legacy GEO satellite operators and the LEO broadband systems. You're seeing mergers, as I mentioned, with the Eutelsat OneWeb and other players that are choosing to build their own LEO systems. Jumping on, let's talk real quick about the Earth observation industry. You saw my chart where it went from 0 to 400 satellites on orbit. One cool thing about that is they're not just imaging satellites. Like, that's what we tend to see and think because the human mind and eye can process those images. But there are other sensor technologies out there like thermal and infrared and hyperspectral and synthetic aperture radar. And when you take all that along with radio frequency mapping and weather, and you start integrating all of those sensor technologies, you get great solutions that happen for really problems like overfishing, right? So it used to be in the old days when a ship went out offshore and got out of range of radar, nobody knew where it was or what it was doing. Nowadays, these Chinese fishing fleets that are trying to turn off transponders and hide, they can't do it. There's radar satellites that can easily detect metal in the ocean. There's others that are listening to their electronic signals. There's others that are taking pictures of it. You collate all that data using, machine learning and big data cloud computing, and you have some pretty robust solutions that start to solve real problems like, piracy and overfishing and pollution at sea. And that's just one example of where these technologies are happening. And we're really still on the cusp, the early side of a lot of this stuff rolling out. I use as an example here Maxar, which has historically been the leader in this industry. Back in 2014, their state-of-the-art satellite, the WorldView 3 satellite, cost about $650 million and weighed 2.8 tons. Their new constellation, which they're launching this year, a half dozen satellites, about 100 million apiece, 700 kilograms. And there's other companies that are launching satellites that are 3 kilograms in size, or 50 or 100. And so you've got, I think, 6 dozen companies that are building constellations of imaging satellites. Really cool stuff. Talk about the satellite manufacturing market and what's going on there. We talked about some of the technology that was impacting Satcom, and this is where it's coming from, right? These satellite builders are introducing new technologies that improve the price and performance of satellites. And if you want to see the impact on the industry, check out the chart on the right. And what that's showing are commercially competed GEO satellite orders. This was the lifeblood of the manufacturing industry for decades. And what happened was in 2015, when SpaceX and OneWeb popped on the scene and said, hey, we're going to build these LEO constellations, the number of GEO satellites being ordered got cut in half. And that was in part because the increased competition, the threat of price competition, and lower latency has caused the GEO operators to really claw back a lot of their spending to make sure that they can remain competitive. Jumping on, we talked about launch vehicles. I guess the trend I would highlight here is, as it's gotten cheaper to launch stuff, suddenly the guys who are building satellites say, it's so cheap, why don't we throw on more capability? And I'll give you an example of that. So Planet Labs, when they first started building satellites in the early 2010s, had one form factor, and it was what was called a 3U CubeSat. It weighed about 5 kilograms. And what's happened over time is Planet has kind of moved upstream. First, their SkySats were about 110 kilograms, and then they announced their Pelican, which I think was 180, and now the Tanagers, I always pronounce it wrong. It's a bird. These things are up over 200 kilograms in size. And in part, they're adding new capabilities and much higher resolution, different spectral bands, but they can afford to do that because the cost of launch has gotten cheap. So what happens when satellites start getting bigger? Well, you gotta build your rocket bigger in order to make the economics work. And that's the trend we've seen here in this chart is, companies like a Relativity that started off with their Terran 1, they did one test launch and man, they're moving on to the Terran R, which is really a Falcon 9 equivalent rocket. And you'll continue to see, I believe, certainly as Starship comes online, other companies starting to target larger rockets. Talk about some cool technologies that have emerged in the last several years. I've thrown off some of these, we don't have to do a deep dive on all of these, but for the LEO broadband constellations, right? These guys spending $10 billion building out constellations, they have said they're going to have optical crosslinks. And this is a core technology that can allow data to move in space that otherwise would have to be beamed down to the ground. And I'll kind of roll up here on a final slide, which is to talk about that cislunar activity that I kind of mentioned before. And the point being here is you're seeing both the government and commercial providers beginning to invest in these activities that happen in space. And to be clear, through most of history, everything that happened in space was to send a service down to the Earth. And what you're seeing is companies that now want to mine and harvest resources in space that could be used to build structures in space, to refuel rockets. You've got activities happening on the lunar surface. And as all this happens, you need to build out the infrastructure. So that means you need your own GPS system in space. You need, your traffic lights and your COPS out there, which are the space situational awareness satellites. There's just a ton of infrastructure for refueling and servicing. And there are, as I said, dozens of companies pushing in this area. I think I ran a little bit longer than I was planning here because there is a lot of fun stuff to talk about. I think I've had, Anna, some questions roll in, and if you wanted to throw those out, or if anybody hasn't had the chance, I will note just before I jump off here, if you're interested in some of the stuff that we do at Quilty Space, just visit our website. You can jump on and go ahead and sign up. We have some free content we send out. We track some monthly transactions. We highlight some news stories. And if you want to access some of the reports, we've got some paid options that are available also for the content. And with that, I will say thank you for your attention, and hope everybody wasn't trying to multitask because you missed it.
Great job, Chris. All right, let's get into some questions. We have a question from Louise asking, where do you see the most growth in the space? Is it in infrastructure, transportation, networks?
Oh, it's a good question. And you have to define growth, right? Are we talking growth in terms of revenue, growth in terms of profitability, or growth in terms of spending? So what I would say is from at least from an investor perspective, I think a lot of investors continue to focus on those traditional satellite communications markets, which, as I mentioned, there's growth within segments of that. I think the direct-to-device market is going to go from zero to billions of dollars in the next several years. But even traditional companies like Iridium, that I mentioned previously, this is the company that went bankrupt circa 2000. They're now the most valuable public space company out there at about a $9.5 billion valuation, growing nicely, doing sort of mundane activities like internet IoT from space and communications and maritime and aviation and connecting the world.
Now, let's talk a little bit about your platform. Woody has some questions wanting you to clarify. You have a tracking platform and an investment banking department. Can you clarify that for him?
Yeah. So, as I mentioned, I was a research analyst at Raymond James for 20 years. And, I kind of continued that trade here at Quilty Space. And I have a team of folks, Caleb Henry, who's my primarily partner, came over from Space News, and he's been working with me for the past couple of years. And we've got a team of people. And we write research both on individual companies, sort of what might look like a traditional sell side report, but much more in depth. And then we do a lot of technology and strategy discussions. We've written deep dive reports on, commercial weather, very high resolution satellites. We just did a report on direct to device. But then we do have sort of traditional investment banking activities with my partner, who is my banker at Raymond James. And, we tend to do primarily mergers and acquisitions, but also some capital raising, private placement, and advisory services. On the research side, honestly, up until last week, we only had enterprise customers for the services, and we're in the process, please forgive us, it's still beta, of rolling out a new website and a new capability that will have a lot of the data analytics tools that, if you're a space professional and you need to pull numbers from either financial stuff where you're looking at companies and valuations and growth, that data will all be hosted there. But also if you're somebody who's in the strategy group and you want to run numbers and pull the number of satellites on orbit or launch activity, and those are all tools that will be enabled through the website for subscribers.
Wonderful. Perfect. Also a question from Fred White. Fred says, many companies in the sector are multinational companies, as you know. So what is your opinion as to the risk in investing in space that the government, due to security or other reasons, chooses to take back some of these projects from the private sector?
Oh, I think that horse has left the barn, at least here in the US, right? I mean, I showed, I think, in spades that government agencies, whether it's NASA or the Department of Defense, have found religion. And they realize that these commercial companies can do it better, they can do it cheaper, they can do it quicker. The government is not good at high technology, and that's what space is. Now, it's not the same everywhere else in the world, and I'll fully admit there's a lot of parochialism that goes around. Europe is very supportive of their space industry and the companies in it. They are building their own constellation, kind of like the DoD is, and they've made it explicit. You have to be a European company in order to participate in the program, and they've done set-asides of 30% of the contracts for local contractors. But this is by definition, space is a global industry. Just here at Quilty Analytics, 10-person group, we've done transactions in Israel, in South America, Lithuania, Norway, you name it, Japan, no China, no Russia, right? That's about it. So those are closed markets, but you're even seeing India open up, which had traditionally been a closed market. So, and at the governmental level, look, there's all sorts of roadblocks that happen with technology transfer or sales of companies cross-border that could be challenges. But at the end of the day, it's all manageable. And, the space economy is growing so quickly that, you're seeing emerging countries like the UAE. UAE is sending missions out to Mars. They've got astronauts that they've put in, on the International Space Station. The Saudis just put, on a commercial flight, astronauts on the space station. So it is a global industry.
What a fascinating time to be in this industry, isn't it, Chris? All right, we are out of time, but I want you to leave us with some closing remarks or a takeaway for our audience.
Oh, goodness. So, I think there's not to speak to any of the specific companies here, but there are a lot of bubbling up activity happening with startup companies and new markets that entirely new markets like the cislunar that I think as a kid, if I thought back, 30 or 40 years ago, I thought this stuff would have been happening by the time I got out of high school. Well, guess what? A lot of it is starting to happen. And I think you really have to have an expansive view on what is going to happen. Things that you thought were fanciful. I mean, how many people here knew that NASA was doing commercial contracts, buying trips to the moon? There was a company, a buddy of mine who's just down the street, who just got his seed funding round for building data centers on the moon. And here's the shocker. Guess what? You know why you build a data center on the moon? Because it's cheaper.
Yeah.
It's cheaper than building on Earth. And you may scratch your head and say, it ain't right. But I've deep dived the model, and guess what? You don't have land acquisition costs. You don't have cooling costs. You don't have security costs. You got one-time transportation costs. You got free power, from solar panels. And all this happens because you've changed the one variable that matters, which is launch. So let your imagination run wild. What could you do in space when you can get there cheaply?
Right. The sky is the limit. Wonderful. Chris, thank you so much for this great presentation. And we would love for you to join us again in the near future with some updates.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone, stay with us. We're going to take a quick break. We're back at 3:40 Eastern Time with Terran Orbital. We'll be back.